By the early 1950s, the Iceman had already begun to disappear from most American neighborhoods. Within a decade, he would be gone almost entirely, replaced by the electric refrigerator sitting in the corner of every kitchen in the country. The job had existed for nearly a century. It vanished in a generation. The reason was simple. Mechanical refrigeration became cheap enough that ordinary families could own it. And once they did, there was no reason left to have a man haul frozen blocks up your back stairs twice a week. But if you grew up before that happened, if you remember the truck and the tongs and the way the ice sat dripping in the box until your mother put the food around it, you know the story wasn't really about refrigeration. It was about a system that organized daily life in a particular way, and what it meant when that system quietly stopped. The ice itself came from somewhere most people never thought about. Through the 19th century, it came from lakes and ponds, cut in winter by crews working long days in the cold, scored into blocks with hand saws and horse-drawn blades, then packed in sawdust and stored in ice houses built to hold temperature through the summer months. The industry that grew up around this was larger than most people today would guess. By the 1880s, natural ice harvesting employed tens of thousands of workers and supplied cities up and down the eastern seaboard. Boston shipped ice as far as India. The blocks arrived insulated in hay, and they kept well enough on the voyage to be sold at the other end. It was a genuine commodity, traded like timber or coal, and the men who cut it, stored it, and delivered it were as much a part of the industrial economy as anyone working in a mill or on a railroad line. By the early 20th century, artificial ice production had replaced the natural harvest in most urban markets. Ice plants used mechanical refrigeration to freeze purified water into uniform blocks, which were more reliable in size and cleaner in composition than lake ice. The plants ran year-round, the supply became predictable, and the delivery routes that fed off that supply became one of the most recognizable features of American neighborhood life. The route itself had a logic to it. The Iceman drove a horse-drawn wagon in the earlier decades, then a truck as the routes modernized, and he moved through the same streets on the same days week after week until he knew every house on the block. Not just which door to go to, but how much each family needed, which households had more people in summer, which old widow lived alone and only needed a small piece every few days. He carried the ice with a pair of steel tongs, gripping the block from above, the weight of it pulling against his forearm and shoulder. A full block could weigh 100 pounds. He managed it up steps, through narrow hallways, into kitchens where the icebox sat against the wall. The icebox itself was a wooden cabinet insulated with cork or mineral wool, designed to hold a block in the top compartment and keep the lower shelves cold through conduction. There was a drain pan underneath that collected the meltwater. You emptied it, or it overflowed onto the floor. That was the maintenance the system required. In summer, a block might last 2 or 3 days before it shrank to nothing. In winter, the same block could last a week. The Iceman adjusted his deliveries accordingly, and most families left a card in the front window to signal how much they needed that visit. The cards were printed with numbers on each quadrant: 25 pounds, 50 pounds, 75, 100. And you turned the card to show the right number facing up before he came by. He saw it from the street and knew exactly what to bring. The price for this was low enough that almost any working family could afford it. In the 1920s and into the 1930s, ice delivery cost somewhere between $1 and $2 a week, depending on the city and the amount used. That was real money for a family living close to the edge, but it was also unavoidable. Without ice, food spoiled. Milk went sour by the second day in summer. Meat couldn't be kept more than a few hours. The icebox was not a luxury. It was as essential as the stove, and the delivery that kept it functional was part of the weekly budget the same way rent and coal were. The men who ran these routes built genuine relationships on that dependability. A family that had used the same ice company for 10 years knew the driver by name and knew his schedule the way they knew the mail. If he was late, someone would notice. If he was sick and a substitute came, it felt like a disruption. That kind of embedded familiarity is hard to replicate in a transaction that doesn't happen in person on a regular schedule, and it meant that the job carried a social weight that the simple economics didn't fully account for. What ended it was not a single invention, but the convergence of several things happening at once. Mechanical refrigerators had existed since the 1910s, but through the 1920s they were expensive, unreliable, and used refrigerants that were toxic enough to make a leak a genuine household emergency. The early models required service calls and broke down often enough that many families who could have afforded one chose not to. By the mid-1930s, the technology had improved substantially. Sealed compressor units became standard. Safer refrigerants replaced the earlier compounds. The cabinets became more reliable, and the manufacturers began competing on price in a way that brought the cost within reach of middle-class households. Then came the Depression, which slowed adoption, and then the war, which halted appliance manufacturing almost entirely as factories converted to defense production. When appliance manufacturing resumed after 1945, it resumed its scale. Returning veterans were buying homes in the new suburbs, and those homes needed to be furnished. Refrigerators sold in enormous numbers through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. By 1950, more than 80% of American homes had a mechanical refrigerator. By 1955, the number was close to 90. The icebox, which had been a fixture in American kitchens for 3 generations, was disappearing from the room it had defined. The ice delivery routes contracted as the customer base shrank. A driver who had serviced 200 stops on a route might find himself down to 80, then 40, then fewer. The fixed costs of the truck, the ice plant, the insurance, the wages didn't shrink proportionally. Routes that had been profitable became marginal, then impossible to justify. Companies that had been in business since the turn of the century wound down their residential delivery operations through the 1950s, some quickly, some slowly, depending on the age and habits of the neighborhoods they served. Rural areas held on longer than cities. Older neighborhoods held on longer than newer ones. But the direction was the same everywhere, and by the early 1960s, residential ice delivery was largely a memory in most of the country. The ice plant itself survived in a different form. Bagged ice for coolers and parties became a separate business. But the man with the tongs and the card in the window and the route he had run for 20 years was gone. What disappeared along with the job was a particular texture of neighborhood accountability. The Iceman saw your kitchen on a regular basis. He noticed if something was wrong. If a regular customer didn't come to the door, he'd knock. If an elderly woman's card stayed in the window untouched for 2 days, he'd say something to someone. That informal watching out was a byproduct of a delivery system, not its purpose, but it was real, and it mattered. When the refrigerator replaced the icebox, it replaced the need for someone to come inside the house on a schedule. The service became self-contained. The food stayed cold without any human involvement from outside the household. That was the point. It was more reliable and more convenient, and it cost less over time. All of that was true. But the accountability that came with regular human contact, the simple fact of being seen by someone whose job brought them to your door, that didn't transfer to the new arrangement. It just stopped. If this brought back something you hadn't thought about in a long time, the card in the window, the sound of the tongs, the drip pan under the icebox, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the parts of American daily life that changed so quietly most people didn't notice until they were already gone. Leave a comment telling us where you grew up and what you remember. That part of the record only you can fill in.